Executive Director of the Kemetic Institute, the head priest and founder of the Temple of the African Community of Chicago. He's the author of a very important book on the history of the Haitian Revolution, The Irritated Genius. He is also the author of another important book, Essays in Ancient Egyptian Studies. And he's also the author of a book that will come out in the fall that is one of the most profound books that I've had the occasion to read, because I have read all of Dr. Carruthers' written works before they come out. Somehow he thinks some of us have something to say about what he's doing. Dr. Carruthers is a warm, gentle master teacher. And I bring to you my teacher, my friend, Dr. Jacob Carruthers.
Let me first of all greet you with the ancient African greeting from the Nile Valley, Yemhotep. May you come in peace, welcome, greetings. I guess Conrad finally paid me back for giving that job. That made me feel good, but it was much too inflated. But thank you anyway, brother. I would like to thank all of you for having the patience to come here and participate in this very important meeting. I would like to thank you for staying around to hear me after my cousin did such a brilliant job. I would like to commend the Houston chapter of the National Black United Front for the excellent conference that has been organized here. And I'm proud that Houston came through. And I would like to commend all of the members of National Black United Front for the great job they've been doing over the last decade and more. Truly, they have advanced the cause of African liberation, and they have inspired many of us to get to work and do the thing that we have to do. I would like to thank the African community of Houston for allowing us to come into this arena and share ideas. It's always good when African people get together. And it's especially good when we get together to discuss important themes like we're discussing this weekend. I would like to bring you greetings from the Center for Inner City Studies, where I've been working for the last quarter century. Commendations on what you're doing from that source, and the Kemetic Institute, and the Temple of the African Community of Chicago. Some of us are here, and we are all with you in spirit, in good old African spirit, as we say in our temple. I do have a Houston connection, and Conrad gave you my Texas background in outline. I not only went to school here and got a master's degree at Texas Southern, but I did a little teaching here. And I learned a great deal while I was teaching from some of my students, because I was teaching here briefly in 1960 when Texas Southern students joined the student rebellion that was called the Sit-In Movement. And those students from Texas Southern went out into the streets of Houston and started a revolution right here in Houston. I was amazed. And when they came back to my class in Texas government, they stopped me and started teaching me something about Texas government that I never knew. And that started my true education. I also have in this audience some protection in case my speech doesn't go off too well and I need some help. I brought my nieces here. I think they had to leave. But I do have some members of my gang here, and let me just, the people I grew up with. Wilma Barnett, is she still here? No. Hi. And Robert Gray, and Floyd Stringfellow. Some of the people I grew up with, and who didn't get run out of Houston like I did. I would like to begin by taking a cursory look at some happenings. If we just take a brief glance in the newspaper this week, we will find that the Europeans are escalating in their re-entry into Africa. I'm talking about Somalia. They are intensifying their efforts to crystallize white supremacy in South Africa. Again, we see that the white supremacists, a la the skinheads, are attempting to organize a nationwide race war toward the objective of the genocide of African people. Again, we see that the white supremacists who call themselves conservatives are launching verbal and political attacks on the reputations of African women this time who would be governmental appointees. I'm talking specifically of Lanny Grenier and Joycelyn Elders. Again, the white supremacists are refusing to allocate funds for the education of African children. And they are trying to dominate that paltry education that they are approving of. And they are attempting to stop African-centered curriculum. Those are just some of the things that are going on. They are merely symptoms of the larger problem. But it's very important that we understand that the war of the white supremacists against African people is continuing in full force day by day. Nothing has changed. And therefore, it would do us well to look back, as Cousin Asa put it, this time specifically to about 100 years ago, to the 1890s, and to look close to home right here in good old Texas, and especially in the southeastern part of Texas, because so many things were going on 100 years ago in Texas that can give us some insight into what's going on in 1993 in Texas and everywhere else. I want to start by focusing on a statement that an African man living in Galveston, Texas made in 1893. He said, "A nation or race has other possessions beside geographic limitations. Dearer than all else should be its tradition, history, literature, and music. For upon the proper education of the masses in these requisites depends durability of that race or nation's fame and its guarantee of future greatness. It is only on these solid bedrocks we can hope to build up a healthy and substantial race pride." In the 1890s, when that statement was made, The African community in Texas was in the greatest struggle of its lifetime, and that is the struggle against white supremacy. And I would like to sort of give you the flavor of how the African American community was dealing with that struggle by focusing on three leaders who were located in this region. They were based in Galveston in the 1890s. One of them was the man who wrote the statement that I read. His name was William Easton. And he was one of the leaders of the African population in Texas during that very, very critical period. And that statement comes from the preface of a play he wrote. And the play was a play about Dessalines, the hero of the Haitian Revolution. And he felt it necessary in 1893, about 100 years after the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, to look back on that Haitian Revolution as a model, to try to give some guidance to the African people in this country about how to get out of the mess that they found themselves in the 1890s. And also living in Galveston at that time was another African, a man named Norris Wright Cuny. Cuny, does that ring a bell? Right across the street, there's the Cuny homes. They were named for Norris Wright Cuny. In 1893, Norris Wright Cuny was the leader of the black Republicans, and thus he was the leader of the Republican Party in Texas. And he also, in that same year, wrote an essay, a dedication to the Haitian Revolution. They were both studying the most important event that had happened in modern history where African people was concerned. An event where African people had defeated three of the greatest armies in history. The French army of Napoleon, the English army, and the Spanish army. And those African leaders were studying that revolution to give them some guidance at a very critical period. The third leader based in Galveston at that time was a man named Sutton Griggs. He had gotten a college degree from Bishop College, which was one of the first black colleges in Texas. And he wrote his first novel that was published in 1899. And the title of that novel was Imperium in Imperio. And in that novel, Sutton Griggs examined a theme that had been raised by the African leadership in Texas in the 1890s about the possibility of the establishment of an independent black nation in Texas. Did y'all know that? In other words, in the 1890s in Texas, African people were mobilizing political power as best they could in the face of brutal white supremacy. Some of them were organizing around the idea of making Texas an independent black republic. African people were fighting to establish African education in Texas in the 1890s. They were fighting to establish African-centered education, if you please, for African youth and African adults, and fighting against the attempts of the whites to stop public money from going to black education. In the 1890s, the African leadership in Texas was fighting to protect African people against the violence of the re-emerging KKK, very much like the emerging skinhead movement, which has one of its strongest branches right here in Texas on this day. They were dialoguing about leaving Texas, some of them were. Some of them were saying, let's go to Kansas, and thousands went to Kansas. Some of them said, let's go to Oklahoma, and hundreds of them went to Oklahoma. And some of them said, let's go back home, let's go to Africa. And some of them made it back home. In other words, 100 years ago, here in Texas, African people were engaged in the same kind of dialogue we engage in today. And Texas was only a microcosm, because the same kind of thing was going on all over the country. In the arena where I'm located now, up in Chicago, in 1890, T. Thomas Fortune and some other Africans organized the Afro-American League. In 1893, Frederick Douglass came to Chicago because the Chicago people organized a pavilion on the Haitian Revolution. And he gave an address on the Haitian Revolution where he said, it is the best inspirer for African freedom that we have ever had. In other words, they were doing much of what we're doing now. In 1897, Alexander Crummell and W.E.B. Du Bois organized the American Negro Academy to address the issues that we are addressing today. Why were they doing all of that? The reason they were doing all of that is because they were fighting against the most vicious system of suppression and oppression that has ever been visited on any people. And that is the European project of white supremacy. And unfortunately, that process that they were fighting about was materializing right under their nose in the form of segregation, which was nothing but a neo-slavery system. As anybody who remembers what Grandma and Grandpa said about what was going on in 1900 in Texas and other places. They were fighting against the emergence of European colonialism on the continent that Conrad talked about earlier today. In other words, they were fighting a war that we lost because white supremacy won that battle in the 1890s. They established segregation, they established colonialism, and they extended logically the project that they had started 2.5 centuries ago, and that is the project of universal white supremacy that they labeled Western civilization. So, what I would like to talk about is, first of all, a kind of outline sketch of the establishment of white supremacy. Secondly, to discuss the rise and fall of Negro education. Third, to revisit the development of the Black Studies movement and its successor, the African-centered education movement. And then finally, I'd like to make a few concluding remarks about the happenings that I started out with. First of all, though, before I get to that, let me make a comment or two about Houston and Texas Southern. Because in a very substantial sense, Houston was one of the major battlegrounds of the civil rights movement, which gave the African nationalist movement an opportunity in the 1960s to regenerate itself. And let me just review what went on in Texas in the context of the civil rights struggle. In 1923, the state of Texas passed a law barring black people from voting in the Democratic primaries, called the white primary. And that's because the black people in Texas, even after the terrorism had continued to vote, they still went to the polls in unprecedented numbers. And so the white people passed a law barring black people from the Democratic Party. And the black people in Houston organized through the NAACP and brought a series of court cases that finally brought down the white primary that established a base for some of the political empowerment of black people. They started with the Nixon versus Herndon case in 1927, the Nixon versus Condon case in 32, the Grovey versus Townsend case in 35, which they lost, and then finally the triumph in the Smith versus Allwright case in 1941. And they won the right to dismantle the Democratic primary and to allow black people to vote. That's important because it set the stage, really, for the dismantling of the legal segregation system. And Texas Southern figures in that very important. In fact, some of you may know that they ought to name this school the Heman Marion Sweat University, because it is, in a very substantial sense, the university that Heman Marion Sweat built, although negatively. Because when that postman, a man who delivered mail here in Houston, Sweat, applied to the University of Texas after World War II, he was denied admission, and a case was brought against the state of Texas. And when it was apparent to the Texas powers that we were going to win that case, they took Houston Negro Junior College over and turned it into the University of Texas for Negroes. And what we did was to change that title around a little bit, and we called it NUTS, N-U-T-S. That was the first acronym that we used for Texas Southern. Not to take anything away from Texas Southern. That's how Texas Southern got its start. But the Sweat case was finally won. And the Sweat case resulted not only, though, in the establishment of TSU, but the Sweat case also laid the foundation for Brown versus Board of Education, which ultimately overthrew legal segregation. Not that that solved any major problems, but at least it got one barrier out of the way. And a little later on, I'm going to say something about Brown versus Board of Education. Now let us return to the establishment of white supremacy in theory and fact. I don't have time to do the documentation on this establishment, but let me just outline it so that we can start on the same page. I know most of you know it because we have tried to explain it many, many times, but let me just review it. After 3 centuries of the most brutal system of exploitation of a people in the history of humanity, that is from 1440 to the 1740s, the European philosophers decided that it was necessary to justify retroactively what they had done. They decided that they had to give a philosophical reason for the enslavement and the suppression and the genocide that was occurring where African people were concerned. And therefore they began a project, a posse of European philosophers led by Montesquieu, including Voltaire, including Immanuel Kant, and including David Hume, created a doctrine of philosophical white supremacy, a doctrine that was clearly based upon a conspiracy to debase African people so that European civilization could proceed apace. The one problem with that formulation in the middle of the 18th century was that those European philosophers who were at the same time basing their credentials upon their ancestry to the ancient Greeks were not able to explain ancient Egypt. The ancient Greeks thought so much of the ancient African civilization that they said many of our ideas and most of our important ideas came from those Egyptians. Right. And how then could Africans be inherently inferior when they taught the Greeks? That was a big problem for them. But a few generations later, a German philosopher by the name of Hegel solved that problem for them. In a series of lectures that he delivered between 1820 and 1830 that were later published as the Philosophy of History, he solved the problem by asserting that Egypt was not a part of Africa and that Africans were not in Egypt. And furthermore, he asserted that Africans had no history. He attempted to kill the history, not just of a nation, but the history of an entire race. In other words, he committed the crime of historicide. Add that to your vocabulary. The crime of historicide, the attempt to wipe out the whole history of a people. One of the most heinous crimes that has ever been conceived by anybody. And from that point on, the European intellectual community accepted the basic premises and began to deal with everything in terms of the basic assumption that Africans had never been a part of history, that Africans had always been at the lowest level of human development, if at any level of human development. Throughout the 19th century, you see evidence of it. Tocqueville, writing on democracy in America, said that the white man is like a god to the black man. Gobineau wrote a book on the inequality of the races in 1850, where he said that the blacks are at the lowest rung of humanity and have never contributed anything to human development except a little minor art. And Carlyle, the great Scottish philosopher, said in an essay entitled The Nigger Question, now that y'all have told the niggers that they are not slaves, you're going to have to invent a slavery system that you don't call slavery, which is the Bible that the Southerners used here in Texas and other places after the Civil War when they reestablished slavery by calling it segregation. In other words, what we see in the 19th century is the development of theoretical white supremacy that guided the practice of white supremacy more or less systematically. So that every discipline of the social science, whether you're talking about the psychology of Sigmund Freud, or the sociology of Emile Durkheim, or the political science of John Burgess, whatever discipline you look in, including physical ed and medicine, any discipline that had anything to do with human beings and human relations was permeated with the doctrine that Africans are the lowest order of humanity, and genetically so. This was the triumph of universal white domination and African insubordination. And in order to make that theory stick, there was just one more important ingredient, and that is to infuse it into the curriculum. And that infusion was accomplished in two steps. One, it was infused into the general European curriculum by classical studies. The Europeans developed the notion of Greek and Latin and Shakespeare and all that sort of thing as the basis of the curriculum. And they universalized that curriculum. Everywhere the Europeans established schools, they put that curriculum in. And the second phase of it was the phase that established the chains on the African mind that replaced the chains that were on our ancestors' ankles and wrists. And that was what I call Negro education. And it's going to be a little painful to talk about this Negro education because it's something that we all have had to come to grips with, as we have been a part of Negro education on both sides of the fence. And so you can sympathize with me because I never had a white teacher until I started working on a PhD. Kindergarten, elementary school, high school, undergraduate school. My first graduate degree was right here. And I didn't have any white teachers. There were only 2 or 3 here at that time. But anyway, that was a long time ago. But anyway, creation of the philosophy of white supremacy, this atrocity did not go unchallenged. And our courageous black thinkers and leaders, going back to the beginning, into the 18th century and continuing throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, all the way down to the present time, have always waged war against that war that is against African people. I'm talking about people like Bishop Henry Allen. I'm talking about people like Prince Hall. I'm talking about people like David Walker and Martin Delaney and Edward Wilmot Blythe and Henry McNeil Turner and Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X and Sheikh Anta Diop and some people that you know and we love and my mentors, Ben Yakinen and John Henry Clark. Those are the people who have been fighting this demon of white supremacy all of these years. And so, indeed, as Carruthers said, this is nothing new. We've been fighting the broad European-centered curriculum for 200 and more years. And we're going to fight it until it exists no more. Now I want to talk about the crowning point of white supremacy, which was the establishment of Negro education. The Portuguese, about 1450 or so, as they were beginning their exploitation of Africa, as they were beginning to enslave African people, hit upon an ingenious idea. And that is the idea that perhaps the best way to exploit Africa is to take some African people and give them a European education and then send them back to Africa. And so they took some brothers whose names were Nzinga, took them to Portugal, gave them a good Catholic education, sent them back to Africa with names like Dom Pedro. And Africa has not been the same since. Because those European educated Africans have always been, since that time, instruments of disruption and disunity in Africa. But that idea that Portuguese started so long ago was experimented with over the years and the years and the years of the chattel slave system. And finally, in 1790, when it was apparent that the chattel slave system was going to fall, some of the Europeans said we had better prepare for the destruction of the chattel slave system by educating some African leaders. And leading that movement was a group of Quakers headed by Benjamin Franklin, who was supposed to be a friend of the Negro. And what Benjamin Franklin said to the first Congress of the United States was we ought to dismantle the slave system and emancipate the slaves. But as we emancipate them, we must educate them. Because if we emancipate them without educating them, they're going to be more dangerous than they are now. And therefore, he outlined a philosophy of Negro education. And for the next 50 or so years, that philosophy was experimented with. In 1856, they finally decided that it was time to test it, and they established a Negro college in Pennsylvania, Ashman Institute, now called Lincoln University. And then a few years later, they established one in Ohio called Wilberforce. And then after the Civil War, as soon as the guns were silent, they started establishing Negro colleges all over the South. Howard University, Hampton Institute, and so forth and so on. They began to concentrate on Negro education as the solution to the race problem in this country. And then, in 1890, all of the great educators of this country came together in Mohawk. Conrad referred to those conferences this morning in his workshop. They came together in Mohawk, New York in 1890, and then they met again in 1891, and they studied what they call the Negro question. In fact, the title of the publication of the proceedings of those conferences is the Mohawk Conference on the Negro Question. The Mohawk Conference on the Negro Question. Might incidentally point out that there were no Negroes at that conference. Rutherford B. Hayes, who had been a party to withdrawing the troops from the South a decade before, delivered the keynote address at the first conference. Rutherford B. Hayes had by this time become a philanthropist, a friend of the Negro. And he delivered the keynote address. And in that address he started, and I'm just going to read a part of it. Conrad read the whole, a much larger section. A century or two ago, the ancestors of the great majority of the present Negro population of the United States were African barbarians and pagans of the lowest type. They had no skill in any kind of labor, nor industrious habits, and knew nothing of any printed or written language. That was the general consensus of the people who met to discuss the future of Negroes, that Negroes had come from barbarianism, and they should be grateful. At the end of the second Mohawk Conference, a platform was developed that established the context and the control of Negro education down to Brown versus Board of Education. Let me read a few of the planks of that platform. The accomplishing of the primary education of the Negro by the states themselves, and the further development of means and methods to this end till all Negroes are trained in primary schools. Second, the largely increased support of schools aided by private benevolence, which shall supply teachers and preachers for the Negro race. Let me read that again. Which shall supply teachers and preachers for the Negro race. And look, my daddy is a preacher and I'm a teacher, so you understand that I don't have it in. All right? Okay. Third, the grounding of the vast majority of these teachers and preachers in common English studies and the English Bible. In common English studies and the English Bible. And that has to be understood in the context of Rutherford B. Hayes' statement about African culture. And fourth, the extension of industrial education for both men and women. In other words, what Negro education was established to do was to develop a class of Negro leaders who were controlled through their education as teachers and preachers to keep the masses of Negroes in their places working for white people. That was the function of Negro education. That was the reason it was established. Now, fortunately, not all of us who went through that system turned out that way. Some of us used the system against itself and hopefully turned out a little bit better. But that is what was going on. Then, 4 years after the second Mohawk Conference, Booker T. Washington agreed to the segregation system. And whatever benefit our dear ancestor Booker T might have done for us, the one thing that is clear, and that is that he did agree that the segregation system was all right. And that legitimized the segregation system. And so we started responding to a segregation system in 1895. That was the final condition for the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case. Because what the Plessy versus Ferguson case did, even though it had nothing to do with education, But the Plessy versus Ferguson case was to establish white supremacy by law. It had already been established in custom and usage and in violence, but now it was established in law. And that case is extremely important because it is the focus of overturning the segregation system a la Brown versus Board of Education. But let me just point out that the hero of that case for most African people was Justice John Marshall Harlan, who delivered the lone dissent. And his colorblind philosophy that he recommended instead of the majority opinion which set up de jure segregation has been held out as a model of what should have happened in the first place. But let's take a closer look at Justice Harlan.
I can do this with my teacher. We got a real problem. This is so profound, this story. We're going to try to do something because Judon is under a lot of pressure. But really, 2 hours overtime, they need to stay to teach young people. What we'd like to do is just
stop them, don't ask them questions, let them get over to the audience.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Majan Haddock. I am from East Africa. Reverend Judan Boni had asked me to introduce this gentleman next to me who does not speak a word of English. As all of you know, Ethiopia has one of the oldest religions called the Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Swahido Christian Church. We were fortunate enough to start at the church last year. We don't have a building yet. We are seeking for one. And we were lucky enough to have found this man who was raised in the Ethiopian monastery from age 11. Believe it or not, his brother had never seen a car until July of last year. He lived in a true Ethiopian monastery. He is here. He's very pure, he's very holy, and he's just going to do a little prayer for us. His name is Abba Leikum.
Health issues we were talking about this morning. Do you want to go to that?
No, it's supposed to be going on now.
And we're recording again. We're going to have this workshop.
As Judon pointed out over at the Student Center, they were gracious to let us go overtime by 2 hours. They had another activity. So some of you may have, how many of you just came in this workshop and been waiting over here? Please raise your hand. Okay, so just a few. So what we are doing is continuing Dr. Carruthers' presentation. Dr. Hilliard made his presentation first, and the presentations were so profound, we made the decision to come over to this auditorium so Dr. Carruthers can finish his presentation, and then we're finished. He finishes up. Hopefully we'll have enough time to interact and have some questions and answers by these two great thinkers and scholars. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for coming back to continue the conversation. I was beginning to talk about the significance of the Plessy case, which came 5 years after the second Mohawk Conference. And as I was explaining, even though the Plessy case concerned segregation in public transportation, it did make a very, very significant contribution to the establishment of white supremacy, because it gave the legal structure for white supremacy by authorizing de jure white supremacy. And what I was about to do was to read to you a statement that was made in the dissenting opinion of that case by Justice John Marshall Harlan, who incidentally must have been destined for the Supreme Court by his parents, who named him John Marshall, after the very famous John Marshall, who delivered so many important Supreme Court decisions, including the Cherokee Nation decision that we can talk about at another time. But anyway, what Harlan did was to chastise the majority opinion, which authorized the state of Louisiana, our sister state next door, to set up segregation by law and require segregation of the races in public places. Until that time, most Africans who had been pursuing civil rights were under the impression that states couldn't do that because the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, due process, etc., prevented it. But the court ruled nonetheless that the state could establish segregation by law and require businesses to conform to the separation of the races. In chastising his colleagues and predicting a kind of ultimate failure for their veiled efforts to establish blatant white supremacy in law, Harlan said this: "The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is. In prestige, in achievement, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage." In other words, what Harlan was pointing out to his colleagues was that here you are in a very crude, despicable attempt to establish white supremacy by law when white supremacy exists by fact. You don't have to do it by law. And it will be a much cleaner job. Now, I don't want to accuse Harlan, who is a hero, of such evil thought, but you can read the decision for yourself, and you can read his remarks for yourself. That, I think, is very important, because de facto white supremacy is still the law of the land. And what happened in terms of education was that Negro education developed by the Europeans in the context that I suggested in the Mohawk Conference, not only became the vital component of the segregation system, producing leaders who were to be controlled by white boards of education, that is, the preachers and the teachers, but that model was also spread to Africa. Because as the Europeans began to colonize the African continent at the beginning of the 20th century, they came to various institutions in the United States where that model was working and took those ideas back. And in fact, they invited some of the Negro educators to come over and help them establish that same model in Ghana and South Africa and other places. And so that became a kind of universal model for training Negroes to serve the purposes of Europeans. And they thought that they had a beautiful system, but that kind of European arrogance had one fatal flaw. It's the same flaw that the chattel slave system, which it attempted to replace, had. And that is the fallacy that Africans don't like slavery and Africans don't like oppression. And sooner or later, Africans are going to succeed in overthrowing it. In fact, if you look at what happened to the chattel slave system, contrary to what the Europeans have tried to teach, it was Africans themselves who dismantled that system. The self-emancipation process that was emphatic in the Haitian Revolution, but was nonetheless persistent in what is called the Underground Railroad, where every day, 1, 2, 3, a dozen African people decided they weren't going to be slaves anymore, and they just simply stopped being slaves. That system of attrition in Haiti itself, in the 40 years before the Haitian Revolution, 40,000 Africans left slavery and emancipated themselves. And I'm not talking about the freedom fighters who established the free and independent communities. I'm talking about just ordinary Africans who left the plantation, who left the place of enslavement and just became free by self-emancipation. And same thing went on in the United States, and that's why the Civil War occurred. Because so many Africans were leaving the place of enslavement and going someplace else, and the Southerners had a panic and tried to force the whole country to return their slaves to them, to find them and return them. And that's what produced the crisis. So the same thing happened to the segregation system. The Africans began to revolt against it, and particularly the African masses. The children from the masses of Africans began to disrupt that segregated education system. So much so that in the 1930s, the great educators of the European American community started studying why these Negroes are so rebellious, why these Negro children aren't being socialized in this system that's so good to them. They conducted a series of studies under the Rockefeller money that funded the American Youth Commission studies. They hired the best black scholars they could find to go out and find out why the Negroes are rebellious. And the information came back that if this system of segregated education is continued, you're going to have a major black rebellion in this country. That is going to be too expensive for the country to bear. And that's when the white money started going into NAACP. And that's when the Gaines case in 1939 started chipping away at segregation. And then the Sweat case that I've already discussed finally succeeded in 1950, and finally the Brown versus Board of Education case. Whatever else you may say about the Brown versus Board of Education case, it attempted to solve the problem of that impending black revolt by evading the essential problem that was created by the segregation system. Because the Brown versus Board of Education case tried to solve the problem by equating segregation with racial isolation. So much so that many of us who have been educated tend to think that that was what segregation was just purely and simply racial isolation. And then we remember what happened to us in East Texas and Mississippi when we were with white people every day, on elevators, in the stores, in the warehouse, rubbing shoulders. White people were crowding out our cafes and our restaurants. What did they mean, racial isolation? That wasn't the point. The point was, wherever we were face to face with white people, we were supposed to act like slaves in front of those white people and say, yes, sir, no, ma'am, yes, sir, and so forth and so on. We were supposed to respect them as our bosses, and they were forced, whether they wanted to or not, to treat us with disrespect. And if they weren't, they'd get beat up just as much as we'd get beat up for insubordination. In other words, what segregation was a white supremacy system. And racial isolation here and there was more or less incidental to it. That's why in some cities, you could sit in the balcony in the theater, and in other cities, you couldn't sit in the theater at all. That's why in some cities, you could ride white cabs, in other cities you couldn't. There was so much inconsistency. But the point was white supremacy. But whatever the case, those young people started rebelling against that education system, and it was finally dismantled. What the Supreme Court did in Brown versus Board of Education was evade the issue of white supremacy. And therefore, what was left after desegregation was ordered, and I'm not talking about whether desegregation ever came about in any operational sense, but I'm talking about what was left after desegregation was ordered, after de facto segregation was allowed, was the curriculum of white supremacy. That was still intact. And that's what happened when our young college students, starting in February of 1960, started the sit-in movement. They didn't understand everything that was going on, but they were tired of the dragging around on the issue of dismantling segregation, and they started the sit-in movement. And then they realized that they had to go another step, and they got into the voting mobilization movement. And then they realized they had another step, and on and on. And finally, when they went into those white colleges and universities that tried to implement the idea of integration by taking over the education of black youth, they found the curriculum of white supremacy in all of its power, and they launched the Black Studies movement. The Black Studies movement has been greatly misunderstood, but what it did, besides spawning ethnic studies and women's studies and curriculum reform, and finally its own nemesis, multicultural education, what it did was begin to attack the curriculum of white supremacy. It was designed to overthrow the curriculum of white supremacy. And somehow or another, many of us were foggy on that, and we didn't quite understand that. And we got away from the past, and we didn't stay on the path. And when the onslaught came against us in the form of multiculturalism, saying, well, now that we understand multiculturalism, we don't need black studies anymore. Then some of us got together and decided that this African-centered movement was the logical development and the logical way to approach the realization of what black studies started out to be. And that is an instrument to dismantle the curriculum of white supremacy. So that's where we were in the 1980s, launching that movement as our organizations turned to the issue of education, as ASCAC was formed. That's where we were, and that's where we have been marching. And fortunately, because, as Asa pointed out, this isn't anything new, that is, we are building on the foundations of people going all the way back to the time of Prince Hall when he established the African Lodge. We are a long way toward victory. We didn't have to do all of the spade work in putting our theory together. We had Carter G. Woodson. We had Leo Hansberry. We had all of those courageous African thinkers who had been dedicating their lives to that. And so we were able to put it together relatively quickly. And all of a sudden, doing what we felt was best for our children and our community, we found that the war was intensified because we had hit the nerve of the Europeans. We had hit a sore spot of the Europeans. Because one of the things that we started doing in the 1980s was realizing that we had to refute Hegel and had to take the Nile Valley civilization back. And when we said we're going to put Egypt back in Africa and Africans back in Egypt, the Europeans went crazy and they sent out their big guns. They sent out the Egyptologists, they sent out the historiographers, they sent them all out. And I don't want to be cocky, but they beat the hell out of us. But we knew what we were talking about. And we had the truth on our side. And so, what I can say is that in a very substantial sense, we now stand at the brink of victory. That shouldn't cause us to do what Santa Ana did. Y'all don't know about Santa Ana, do you? Oh, yeah. There's a river that's a few miles away from this building right here called the San Jacinto River. And when the Mexicans defeated the Davy Crockett crowd and drove them across that San Jacinto River, the Mexicans thought they had won the war. And Santa Ana, who was the president of Mexico and the general of that army, went to sleep that night after a little tequila. And when he woke up, some of the Texans was sitting on his bed with a gun to his temple. That was 1836, I believe. And then they blackmailed the white male, the Mexican nation into surrendering Tejas, which the Texans named Texas. And that's how y'all got this state. Well, they got this state. So, Santa Ana was on the brink of victory, but he went to sleep. We are on the brink of victory, but let us not do what Santa Ana did, let's go to sleep. See, we ought to learn something from this. We know about a number of things that we've won, but one of the things that I want to point out in this victory that we are looking at is that it is worldwide. Because the African-centered movement, which we have been pushing and promoting, has been adopted by the Organization of African Unity. I attended a conference. Last April in Abuja, Nigeria, convened by the Organization of African Unity, hosted by the Nigerian government, where there were 33 African nations represented, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States and Canada and Britain, where all of us Africans got together and started planning for the extension of the reparations movement, which was started here in this country and which has been recently revived by Brother Obadele and Chokwe Lumumba and others, where that movement was extended to the continent, where the Pan-African movement is now being reborn, and one of the essential and fundamental moments of that movement is the inclusion of African-centered education. Because now the continental Africans are realizing what we've been doing a long, long time, and that is that until we liberate the African mind, there's going to be no African liberation. So we are at the brink of victory. But let us not become euphoric, and let us not do what was done in the middle of the Haitian Revolution. Because in the middle of the Haitian Revolution, some of the leaders made a compromise, and that compromise cost 500,000 lives and 10 years more of struggle. Let us not compromise. We don't have to compromise. Now that we are at the brink of victory, they are offering us all kinds of enticements. They're saying, hey, leave Egypt alone, take Nubia. We'll elevate and glorify Nubia, so leave Egypt alone. They're saying, hey, come on and help us with multiculturalism and all of that sort of thing. Don't compromise. We don't have to compromise. Because you know what we have won is not in convincing the Europeans that we are right. That's not where the victory is. The victory is in convincing Africa. Because when we as African people decide we are going to take over our education, then it's over. We will have won. We will have won. And all we have to do is deal effectively with the white question. You see, the white people 100 years ago were talking about the Negro question. We now are dealing with the white question. That's what's going on in South Africa. There's an argument among Africans over the white question. What are you going to do with the white people? And if they could ever answer that question, then victory would be immediate. Let us not be divided over that white question. And the way not to be divided over it is to not compromise. No compromise. No time for complacency. Because returning to the happenings that I started out talking about, the Supreme Court is on the loose again, like it was from 1860 in the Reese case, in the Cruikshank case, when they started allowing white violence against black people, when they started allowing white people to disfranchise black people, through the civil rights cases of 1881. Every step of the way, we were told. Now, we aren't really establishing any violation of equal protection law. This is just simply a defining of those in more specific terms. Every step along the way, that's what we were told. That's what our ancestors were told in the 1880s and 1890s. And then in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson authorized the establishment of a system of segregation, which was a new slave system. And every step along the way, they're telling us the same thing. In the Bakke case, they said, hey, that's not a defeat. The result was a defeat. And this last voting case, I don't know the style of this case. This, what is it, Shaw versus Reno case. The one that they just said outlawed the district that they drew in North Carolina to allow one more state representative, congressional representative from that state. The result, though, is that they are diminishing the rights and the powers of African people step by step. And we still got three years before 1996. So beware. I think that when we look at that, what's going on here, the skinheads, the new violence, the punishing of African retaliation against whites under the guise of color blindness and all of that sort of thing, and when we also combine that with what is going on in Somalia, the re-entry of Europeans. 100 years ago, Britain was in East Africa, talking about saving Africans from themselves. A missionary act. They put the British Army in there, they said, to keep East Africans from slaughtering other East Africans. And it took the brothers and sisters 70 years to get them out. How long is it going to take them to get them out of Somalia? Think about it. Let us not become complacent. Let us understand that the war is still going on. And even though we're at the brink of victory, we got to fight every day, and even harder now, to make sure that that victory comes to fruition. I would like to leave this part of the program by reciting the prayer that Bookman Duddy gave on the night that he called the Haitian Revolution. It was the night of August the 14th, 1791, more than 200 years ago. Bookman called all of the potential leaders of a revolution together at the occasion of the Feast of Ogun, an African spiritual celebration in honor of the deity of war and fire and iron, Ogun. And at that meeting, in challenging those leaders to get the mindset that they needed to carry that revolution to fruition, Bookman said, "Good God, who made the sun that lights us up, who raises up the sea and causes the thunder to rumble, though hidden in the clouds, he watches over us. And he sees all that the white man does, because the God of the white man inspires him to crime. But our God, who is good to us, orders us to do good works. He commands us to revenge our wrongs. He will direct our arms and aid us. So throw away the image of the white man's God, who has so often brought down our tears."
Bring it, brother.
And this is it.
But I'd like to know other signs of optimism that you see in the fight for African-centered education.
Well, yeah, it would take me probably all day to just to outline to you what I see, because I have to do it in terms of history. That is what I know to be our history and what I've experienced after a relatively long life. And that is, what I see is that African people in this country, in the Caribbean, and on the continent are becoming conscious at a very, very encouraging rate. Everywhere we go, we see African people coming together like this, reading, studying. We have study groups going on all over the country, in Canada. Sister, I was just talking with a sister, she was telling me about organizing one in Alaska. I was in London in March, and they have study groups all over London. And so I'm just very, very enthusiastic about the extent to which African people are organizing to try to understand and then try to act upon those understandings. I'm also very encouraged by what we are calling the African-centered education movement all over the country. Kansas City, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, all over the country we see parents demanding African-centered education. The level of awareness is very, very extensive.
More specifically to school districts like here in Houston, Texas, that have the mind of a large number of black children, new African children, right here in this school system through August through May. What are some encouraging signs in districts like this? Not that I expect you to know about what's going on here in Houston, but in the, if you want to call it the enemy districts or enemy school systems or whatever you want to call it, what are the encouraging signs in those areas?
Yeah, I think
I
think Asa made a point, okay. And that is we cannot accomplish everything in the public schools. You're going to make more progress in some areas than other areas. But what I'm talking about is that if we make up our minds that we're going to educate our children, that we're going to take education as our duty and stop letting the Europeans educate us in the more fundamental aspects of education, then we are going to start doing it, and we're going to succeed whatever the condition of the public schools happens to be. And that's why I'm so enthusiastic about it. But other people up here have some answers for that.
Yeah, I just want to interject, brother, because of not only is Dr. Hilliard from around these parts, he's been coming down here speaking over the last several years, consulting, as I understand it, with school administrators, teachers, and so forth. The problem in terms of NBUF's position is this is a tactic and a strategy to organize. And we have said over and over the last 2 days that all of us have different roles. These are our high priest of ideas, scholarship, wisdom, and truth. Those of us who see our role as organizers have to take the energy from this wisdom and put it into practice. And what has not happened in Houston, from what I've been able to determine with regard to the site-based management system that they've invoked here, is to organize and disrupt the system and demand that we infuse the curriculum. I mean, that's what's happened across the United States. In Portland, they proved that they boycotted the school system that brought into existence the consultancy of Asa Hilliard. And that motto NBUF has been using around the country to organize. So in order to do what you're talking about here as a tactic and a strategy, the Houston chapter of NBUF has done a great work in the criminal justice area. It's going to have to translate that same energy. Are you in an organization?
Yes, sir.
Are you in NBUF?
Yes, well, no, I'm not.
Okay. Well, we like to ask you that type of question.
And also ASCAP, get an ASCAP too.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that it's very difficult because it's a very complicated kind of thing to assess. Many of the impact areas are very indirect. For example, a little book has almost walked all around the earth, and that's Tony Browder's little book, The Browder Files, and his new book, Nile Valley Civilization. Now, there's lots of other people who have written some of these things, but these are excellent, summative books that communicate to a broad audience. And what I'm running into, and I get to travel probably as much as anybody, and there's hardly any place you can go where somebody isn't making reference to that as their initial step in trying to understand some of the things that we're talking about. It's heavily influential in the prisons. You know, I get probably more mail off those two books, you know, because in one case I had the introduction that I wrote to it, but from prisoners who are asking us. I guess I must have hundreds of letters now, and I've never been asked for anything but books. Nobody's ever asked for money. They've asked for books, and the specificity of the request. You know, they're asking for particular books. Somebody said, "Look, I've got X, Y, and Z, but what I need is D, E, and F. And is there any way you can help me with one or more of these? Or tell me somebody who can." And so that's that's very indirect. And also, I'm looking at all the tours that people have taken to Africa now. Kenneth, of course, is one of the places many of them are going. But I'm looking at the people that I know over the last decade who have come back and begun to do things. A young brother who was an engineer who established a chemical engineering company, and part of what he's after is to try to incorporate this into his daily work and to use profits to support additional things of this kind. Filmmakers, I'm looking at the rap artists, you know, the people who are reading John Clark and who are rapping Clark and Doc Ben, and they're reaching millions of people, you know, and you're looking at this. So I think a lot of this is unmeasurable, but I think it's very massive, and if it can be fed continually, it will have the possibility for expanding even further. You know, this is the reason, for example, one of our strategies when we were attacked at the Infusion Conference, we knew we'd be attacked, so we anticipated the attack. But the nature of the attack is always propagandistic. That's one thing you'll know. It's not scholarly. There's no scholarly attack out there. The attacks are propagandistic. So we responded with scholarship. For example, we put out a book after the first conference, at the second conference, which I'm sure nobody expected, but when they got to the conference, one of the things that everybody, all 2,000 people who showed up, went home with was John Clark's bibliography on African people and world history. Now these things sit around for 5 and 10 years. And who knows which graduate student will pick it up in Billings, Montana, who hadn't been to any meeting, but suddenly had before him something that none of us had before, which is the scope and sequence of ideas on the efforts of African people throughout world history. And then how long will it take that archaeologists to stop doing traditional archaeology and start asking different questions, a la Dr. Alison Brooks, who I was talking about a little bit before. So I think the impact has been massive. I think it's irreversible. I don't think the genie can be put back in the bottle. But it takes an acceleration to achieve the level that we have, Jacob said, to achieve the level that we're capable of reaching. It means that we don't go to sleep, now we speed up. Now that we have these things in motion.
Yeah, I'd just like to say one other victory that's on the horizon. What you heard from Jake and Asa, and you've been hearing from other African-centered thinkers, is a concretizing of thought of our systems of thought and a concretizing of thought of how we view the enemy. And what this is leading to is, before I die, I know I'm going to see it, is a concretizing of a philosophy. That's very important for a worldview. I call it a cosmic world culture. Open-ended and will not be complete because future generations will fill it out. That's what the rap group of young people who met this morning, they were talking about, well, you all started something, but it ain't been finished. We're not going to finish it, but if we leave an outline of what we mean by a just person, just family, just community, just nation, just world, then future generations will be able to fill it in. If we leave it to this generation to figure that out, they will not succeed because they will not survive to be able to do that. That's our mission. So we're on the verge of that happening. And the proof of that is there's agreement among some of the sharpest minds you've got in the African American community in the United States and in the African world around what those general principles are. You heard some of them being expressed today.
I'm sort of confused or more or less the problem I see here. When we talked about Washington, back when talking about segregation, Booker T. Washington, when he agreed with segregation, and then we come up to the school situation where we fought against segregation. Now, during that time, most of our scholars was against the segregation, but now when we come up to the ground situation and we fought against segregation, and when we look at what has happened, we got desegregation integrated into the white society. So how did that approve us by fighting against segregation when we married into the white society, into their system?
Yeah. Thank you very much, brother. We need to clarify that. Segregation, the segregation I was talking about was a white supremacy system of neo-slavery. And I don't know how one who is an African could be for that. Immigration is a white supremacy system of racial domination. And I don't see how any African can be for that either. So, some of us are in both.
I think you really have to watch terminology. Segregation was, if we had defined segregation as white supremacy in the beginning, then in the court case, if you had outlawed white supremacy or tried to outlaw the instruments of it, we would have been better off. But what happened is, along the way, certain other terms were introduced into debate that weren't there before. Like segregation implied desegregation, which was to eliminate the coercive structure and to prevent certain other kinds of things to happen. That's desegregation, don't segregate. Somebody then came along and donated another word called integration, which had nothing to do with the original argument at all. That was a completely different agenda item, rationalized on its own basis. And it was rationalized to say that if you integrated, that would prove that you had desegregated. But what that should have been called, from the point of view of the African community, was disintegration. We hadn't been for that. What we wanted was our money. That's how we started out. You go to Charles Hamilton's book. In fact, I did a lecture here about 4 years ago reviewing Charles Hamilton's book on race and education, A Search for Legitimacy, where he was arguing that we were really on the road to a different agenda, which was closer to the one that Jake was talking about, where we would derail with terminology that did not come from this community. And so our agenda got changed, and then we got confused, and then we began to press the things that were not necessarily answering our problems. You have to really keep your language clear and cold.
Brother Brown, Karen.
First of all, you were talking about that you have a book on the Haitian Revolution, and I would like to have a copy of that. Is that available here?
I said he had a book. He does have a book, but he doesn't bring books because he don't think like that. I'll get you a copy.
Also, I have a question in reference to the effects of integration on us, because growing up, my grandparents tell me, like I'm from St. Louis, and I imagine it's happening in many other places. During segregation, how black people were forced to really come together and sustain and provide for themselves, and how segregation kind of just blew off to the wind. A lot of people want to know just how the process was. Why did we break up? What were some of these factors that broke us?
We broke up. That's what I was really trying to get at. We broke up because we lost our concept of the functions of culture. And so when you buy into what was called integration but wasn't, and what I was calling disintegration, what that meant was that the cultural glue that held the group together couldn't hold if you're never coming together to reinforce and nurture yourself in your own culture and tradition. And so I think that it was almost voluntary servitude, you know, that we went into by choosing to allow the community that were the basis of what we were up to be destroyed. And I think that once we see that, then we wouldn't make those kind of choices.
Karen and this young man here, and I recognize the sister that keep on trying to get everybody. Make your questions real precise. We have about 15 minutes.
There are three records down here. We've been coming to Detroit now for the past, I would say, 8 to 10 years. And we've had various administrations bringing you in. So you've been there with the old superintendent, new superintendent, the old board, and I don't think you've had a chance to come with the new board. You will get an opportunity. And since you've been there last, there's been a number of changes that the community has been fighting for. One change that we've made that we've eliminated the multicultural curriculum, and we do have an African-centered curriculum, and we did deal with the superintendent and the board so they can see the difference. And also, in the last 4 weeks, we have the school board has agreed to not adopt any textbooks and to bring scholars in to rewrite the textbook. I think we will probably be the first board of education in the United States to do this. Now that we've gone this far, since they are very skeptical about what scholars they bring in, I think you're about the only one that the community won't argue with, but scholars like over to Shaka, Carruthers, Dr. World, and those people that we need to sit down and write those books, we don't even know if they're going to call them. So that's our next battle, and battling who they're going to sit down at the table with and who they're going to use to write those books. So I know they're going to give you a call, and while you're here, I'm just letting you know that when they do call you, that you be very particular about who you work with, and you call the scholars that are needed to write these textbooks, so these textbooks can be used throughout the United States.
My brother.
You said that most of the stuff, a lot of stuff has to be done outside the education. I like when you see anything like for the University of Islam, we have a model, something that organization is going on the country.
Of course, the University of Islam, and also Garvey's School of, what do we call it, School of African Philosophy, Marcus Garvey, the Committee Institute, First World Alliance in New York. I'm just saying there are literally dozens of examples of constructing independently an approach to education, and I think exactly what has to happen. You'll have all kinds of forms of that. Some of those things will exist in old institutions like churches, fraternal and sorority organizations, depending on the level of consciousness of those places. I was amazed, for example, I went to the Black Catholic Convention, and I thought I had gone to Ghana. They had 5,000 Catholics in New Orleans, and it scared everybody, including the Pope. And a representative all over, you know, because people were talking about canonical rights. And I'm not Catholic, but I understand that canonical rights mean that you would establish within the Catholic Church, because Father Stalin was so successful outside, that they were trying to keep people inside by any means necessary, which meant that they would give to them permission to have canonical rights. And that meant like the African Orthodox Church. And they were arrayed. I mean, even the white priest had grand movers and all these kind of things. The force was so clear that people were insisting on the right to their ethnic identity. And so that would be another form. And there's just dozens of other forms. And I think we need to you won't see any one way, but certainly the one that you indicated would be a prime example of the way, so we don't have to invent anything new. We have to make decisions.
My sister has been, we're really on this time thing, so just be patient. Any questions, say, please.
I just had one brief comment. When Asa was talking about the different words, desegregation, integration, they're really kind of non-words, and I think if we kind of just stick with white supremacy and just focus on that, just so much easier. Instead of talking about slavery, classic, we're still in the same condition. And I think if we minimize the words we use and put very specific meanings to them, it would be just so much easier for us to talk to each other. And I'm very, very grateful to you all, because from listening to you all for the past couple of years, it's really had a very big change on my life, and I'm very, very grateful.
Here, and then we got to really close this off. We really are. We're just behind and unfair to the other people who are waiting.
I wanted you to elaborate on multiculturalism. I use multiculturalism as a vehicle to create an Afrocentric program that you can tackle. And I want to know what some of the pitfalls are in multiculturalism, so I can avoid those, since I work under the guise of multiculturalism.
Okay, I'll make a statement in reference to it. The only way we can deal with educational movements and educational ideas is historically. And I'll tell you what I think the history of multiculturalism is. And that is that when Black studies began to have such a terrific impact on higher education, spawning ethnic studies, women's studies, curriculum reform and across the board in the universities that trickled down into the high schools and further. Some Europeans started talking about multiculturalism. And one of the first things they said about multiculturalism is that now that we are developing multiculturalism, we don't need Black studies. And they began to work against Black studies, criticize Black studies, and now you have a whole school of European multiculturalists, people who find themselves as Diane Ravitch, one of their leaders, who criticize everything we do and every movement that we have made in the direction of dismantling white supremacy, and have begun to defend white supremacy by adding a little color to the curriculum, which is not what we're talking about at all. So we're saying beware of multiculturalism. Back here, last question. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is, how do we teach our children to deal with Negro principles in the schools? And this is particularly because my children read it. And it's one thing to deal with the teacher, and then when you're dealing with a Negro principal, it's very difficult. And she tells us about multiculturalism. That's my question.
Well, I hate to just give you a short answer. I talked to you, I go with about what to do. Some of them, we've done some very terrible things. And I don't want to talk about that right now, but it really is a question of organizing, because we put in these Negroes, and we can definitely take them out. We have to understand that history. Many of the Black principals who reside over school districts all over the United States got in those positions on the back of the Black vote. We need to understand that. So as they come in, they go.
What do you think about Dr. Jeffrey's case in New York?
Profound. Look, that's one of the victories I'm talking about. One of the victories. Lynn is all of our very good friend that has been working with us in this movement for 20 or more years. So, we are happy and we celebrate with it.
If you talk about a victory for those who were in cities that have court cable, you really don't understand the far-reaching impact. And actually, for me, The negative side was I had to look at it every day and couldn't get my work done for almost a whole month. Because you had to know when to catch it. They came on at night for a review, and I got reports as far away as, Europe, Canada, that people were following this case. And I think the first instance of the impact of our movement was whether or not Dr. Jeffries could wear his proper African attire into the courtroom. That's how the trial started. And his lawyer was so awesome that I've never seen white people look that bad in court by a brother.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question in reference to teachers, empowering teachers. We know about Negro principals and administration, but we all know that once a teacher gets in a classroom, whether she's in public school or even in a private situation, she's the person that's in control. What can we do to empower teachers in helping them teach what kind of training, what kind of training models, what kinds of concrete things can we do to begin to empower teachers in teaching or instructing in the Afrocentric curriculum?
I always cite something that Jake put together in Chicago as a model. They created something between the University of Chicago, Chicago State, and Northeastern, and it's really led by Jake. And they put teachers into a training situation where they had to learn information. That's the key thing. And then they had to learn it at a deep level. Full professors, they were doing a study on the classical literature of the ancient world, which meant that it gave an opportunity to look at African classical literature in comparison to other bodies of literature in the world in an in-depth way where people had to come in front of each other. The classicists, the chematologists, the Mesopotamia, and teachers were engaged in intellectual critique of those bodies of literature. In other words, most of the teacher training that I see is to be faulted on two grounds. One is that too infrequently does it deal with content, substantive content. In other words, teachers are learning touchy-feely, I'm okay, you're okay, some kind of little strategy, or they come up with the newest thing is cooperative learning, or some other kind of teacher expectations of students. Those are all fine things, but if you never learn the content, then when you close your door, you got nothing to offer a kid through those methods. And the second thing is it's to be faulted because teachers never get a chance to apprentice themselves to the teachers who are being successful. And so that a person goes through a teacher training process missing both content and process. And if you can establish a teacher education operation, call it staff development, as people are already working, that has those two components in it, then when they close the door, you can trust them, because you're right. There is no curriculum you can ever write that will express what a person's going to do when they see kids.
Are there some models already in place?
Yeah, Dr. Carruthers Dramatic Institute is in the process of establishing an African-centered teacher trainer institute, and when we conclude in a moment here, you might want to talk to him so you all can exchange. A lot of this will be follow-up. This networking is going on all over the country. This is very, very important to answering many of the questions, because you can't get these instant answers, but we can certainly be in a network, continue to study, continue to communicate, and continue to work on these projects. So I like this thing here.
Let me answer her, please, because Dr. Coulter is right here. The Council of Independent Black Institutions, I'm answering her question right now, has been training teachers for 20 years in Afrocentrism. An officer is right here, and also Abena Walker in Washington, D.C. does specific training for teachers, and you can get her address from Dr. Mauro Bedell.
Very good, very good. Thank you.
Just one point, and I think it's a very important point, because it's got to do with what Asa said about how far we can go in the public schools, and the brother who opened the question about what are the victories inside the educational system. And it's very brief. I learned this from G2 Waves. Ocean Hill, Brownsville taught us a lesson. Ford Foundation sponsored it. It didn't come from the Ford Foundation. It came from the black community. They studied what would be the success of community control of the schools and shut it down at a certain point. And this was the lesson. The degree to which we control our schools is determined by the level of consciousness of our community. Right now, we lack the consciousness to do it virtually anywhere. So what we need to understand is the sky is the limit. If we put the primary emphasis, and this was Ace's point, and I think it takes it back to the arena of how we can win in the secondary battlefield, which is the public arena, because the primary battlefield is the community. We got to raise the community's consciousness. That means empowering parents and community activists around their rights in schools, how schools are run, but more important about the politics of who we are as African people. And that means, finally, schools will be controlled when we decentralize them and place them in the hands of the people. And that's where the technotronic, computer-driven revolution is going. And out of that, the next panel that's coming up, people will start talking about land because consciousness will change.
Thank you, Steve. Hold on, my brother. Hold, brother. Be respectful now. It's at 5:15 to 5:25. We've been talking about discipline for 2 days. I'd like to end this session. I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd like to invite Dr. Ibaro Deli forward, Chokwe Lumumba, Kwame on forward, someone find the model who's supposed to be the moderator. Thank you, Ace.
Yeah, we go. So we probably leave at 8:40. Hi. Kind of shy right now. You?
Nah.
No, we're here in this room that they never told anybody about. You know, I didn't know what room they were until today. I'm really upset, but that's okay.
Don't even try it, because we won't buy it.
Y'all just play it. It's pretty fun. We're gonna go and have some fun now. This is Maurice. This is Casey. But I'm from the Lou. The Louis. St. Louis, here I come. No, I'm just playing. Okay, Daddy. Turn off. Okay. Here.